Well, today I'm going to be brewing a Munich Helles, and this is going to be one of the first beers out of many that I will be brewing using decoction mash in order to find out if it's really worth the bother to go for a decoction mash as opposed to just doing a stepped infusion mash. The recipe, I try to model my recipe using the Munich Helles recipe out of Brewing Classic Styles, except I had to make a few modifications because I couldn't find any melanoidin malt. So I ended up substituting that malt for Vienna malt. Other than that, I pretty much followed the recipe as it is here, except I modified it to fit my equipment. They're using about 10 pounds of pilsner malt, and if I were to use 10 pounds in my system, I would probably overshoot my original gravity, so I just kicked that down to about 8 3/4 pounds based on a 75% efficiency in my system. So aside from those little modifications, I pretty much stuck with what's on the book here, and that's it. Let's get started.
So we start out by prepping our grains. Just gonna dump everything in there. And then we're gonna do any salt additions. I've actually started to do them before I even add any water. That way it mixes in a little bit better. And since I'm starting with RO water, I have to do quite a bit of salt additions. I think I did about 1.5 teaspoons total. And now we're gonna dough in, and our strike temperature we're hoping to get at 108 degrees Fahrenheit. So as I'm adding water, I start to stir the mash, make sure that the water soaks up all the grains, and also all the salts that I added get mixed in with everything at the same time. Now I kind of overshot my temperature just slightly. I think I was about 110, 111, so I added about 1 quart of water. Bring that down. So the mash is going to be not too thick or not too thin, and I'm going to let it sit for about 15 minutes, make sure that the salts get mixed in and the pH drops down to the 5.1 or 5.4 range where we want it to be. So after about 15 minutes, I went ahead and did a pH test on this. Now this wasn't exactly at mash temperature, it's not exactly at room temperature. So what I'm looking at here is about a pH of about 5.4, which I think it's pretty much where we want to be. So after we check our pH, I'm going to go ahead and start bringing my first decoction into my pot. Now I preheated my pot, and to make sure I'm not going to scorch anything, I drop a little bit of water in the pot just to make sure that it's not too hot. So then I just take a strainer and drain as much of the water out of there as possible, and I just drop everything into my decoction pot. Now since this is mostly grain, this is probably the hardest part, or the most labor intensive part of the decoction mash, and it is to keep any of the grains from the first decoction, which is a thick decoction, keeping any of those grains from scorching. Now one thing that I kind of took note for the next time is that whenever you're trying to heat up grains, when it's a thick decoction, low heat is always better than high heat. It's very easy to scorch these grains, so lower heat, trying to bring the temperature slowly with lower heat is better than using high heat to bring out the temperature. And you do have to kind of keep this stirring all the time. Otherwise, your grains will want to stick to the bottom of the pot, and that's what's going to cause this to scorch. So you're going to go through a starch to sugar conversion rest at this point, and you're going to do it at 158 degrees is what I chose. This is going to be done for about 15 minutes, and at that point you're going to start bringing this to a boil. And this is pretty much what a boil looks like when you have pretty much nothing but grains. And one thing you gotta make sure is that nothing sticks to the bottom of the pot that will start scorching, so you gotta keep moving the mash quite frequently during this process. So I kind of took a risk of not stirring the pot much, so I can show you what it looks like when you're boiling nothing, essentially nothing but grains. So then we come to the part where we bring the decoction mash back into the main mash, and you can see the difference in color of the grains, how they've darkened up. So I believe this is where some of the flavor that decoction mash brings to the beer is. This is pretty much where you get some of that flavor. Now, whenever you're adding decoction mash back into the main mash, you want to do it little by little and keep the your temperatures in check. We're trying to get to a protein rest, so I went from, I believe my mash was at 104 degrees, and once I added all the decoction mash, I started to bring the temperature back up to 133 degrees. So we leave the mash sitting for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to start pulling our second decoction. Now for the second decoction, we're going to be pouring both grains and water, so this is not going to be as thick. It's going to be more of a not exactly a thin mash, but it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And we're going to be pulling about 2/3 of the mash. The first decoction mash was about 1/3. So the same thing is going to happen with the second decoction. We're going to go through a starch to sugar conversion rest at about 158 degrees. And we're going to do that for about 15 minutes. Now if you notice, when you do when you first pull the decoction mash, it looks fairly cloudy and starchy. But as the mash sits at this temperature, it's going to get clearer and clearer, and that's how you know that your starch has started to convert into sugar. And again, after 15 minutes, we're going to bring it to a boil. Now, since this is a thinner mash, there's not as big of a risk of scorching the grains as it is with a thick mash, but you still want to stir it every once in a while. The grain tends to rise for the most part because of all the heat, which helps us keep any of the grains from scorching down at the bottom of the pot. And again, we're going to boil for about another 15 minutes here. Okay, now once you're done boiling, then again we're going to start transferring our second decoction mash right back into the main mash. And same thing, we want to do it a little bit at a time so we can make sure that we don't overshoot our temperature. We want to shoot for about 150 degrees, somewhere between 146 to 150 degrees. In my case, I believe I was at 149 degrees. After that, you're going to leave that resting for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then you're going to start lautering. So as usual, you're going to recirculate, pull any of the cloudy wort out, and once you have a clear wort coming out, then you start collecting all that wort. Once you collect all of your wort, then we're going to start bringing this to a boil. Now, since we're using under modified malt, we want to extend our boil. We're going to do a 90-minute boil. So we're going to boil for about 30 minutes before we do any of our hop additions. After those 30 minutes go by, then we do our first, our only hop additions. And we're going to start counting down the rest of the 60 minutes for a full 90-minute boil. So when I was done boiling, I started to cool down my wort, and it's really important to cool down the wort close to yeast pitching temperature. So I used quite a bit of ice water to run through the wort chiller so I can cool down to about 50 degrees is I think where I ended up. Now for the yeast, I had to make a yeast starter. I had to make a two-stepped yeast starter. So I made a yeast starter 2 days before, and then the day before I added more wort. So I basically made another yeast starter using the yeast from the same starter. So you can tell that this is a pretty active yeast going on right here. So if you can't make a yeast starter, two-step yeast starter, this was 2 liters each, then you're pretty much going to have to get 4 yeast packets, lager yeast packets. So again, before you pitch your yeast, you gotta aerate your wort. I've been using the strainer method for a while, and it's worked pretty good. You can see we kept the color of the beer fairly light, which is exactly what we want. And after that, we pitch our yeast and we start to ferment. Fermentation is a very important part of this beer. I started out fermentation at 45 degrees, and that was last Friday. This Friday, 7 days later, I've let the temperature rise to 55 degrees. So it's been almost a degree per day, just under that. And fermentation should be pretty much done, so I'm going to be doing a diacetyl rest. I'm going to bring the temperature up to about 62 degrees before I transfer and start to lager this beer. So that's pretty much it. Stay tuned for results and for other beers. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment if you have any questions. Talk to you guys later.
Just randomly combine caramel, malt, hops, and you're fine.
Let's do it.
All right, that's that.
We'll see. We're missing two.